Hi there, Will here, and today a Q&A, populated with a large variety of questions that people ask me on Instagram, which is quite a departure from the last time I asked people to ask me things on Instagram, because that was like 4 years ago, and I think I got like 2 questions, but this time there was substantially more, so we'll start off in the beginning and see how far we go. I'll try and avoid making this video too long, but I've got 31 questions written down here, and I'm going to try and answer all of them as adequately as I can. So, to start off, did you grow up in South Africa? No, I didn't grow up in South Africa. Well, I spent some time growing up in South Africa. I lived in Cape Town until I was 9. Then my family moved to Tanzania in East Africa until I was 12, I think. Then we lived in Mauritius for a year. Then we moved back to South Africa for 2 or 3 years. And then from living there for 2 or 3 years, we moved back to Tanzania. And that's where I spent the last like 6 or 8 years of my high school. No, 6, probably like 6 or 5, I don't know. But it was between South Africa and Mauritius and Tanzania. What type of subjects would you like to be better at shooting? I reckon I want to get more into still lifes at some point. I think doing still lifes really, really nicely is a very challenging thing without making them look too heavily composed or contrived. I think getting a still life to just exist as a photograph that one can experience and understand without getting too into, oh, I see why they did this or I see why they did that, is something really special. And the person who asked this question actually makes really, really, really good still lifes. His name is Nick Quinn. Nick Quinn. I'll tag him here and you can check out his still lifes. They're stunning. And fashion stuff, beauty stuff. What are your photographic inspirations? I think photography and the idea of photography in general is what I find most inspiring. The nature of the medium and the ways in which one can play around with it and the ways in which people do play around with it. There's so many people doing such interesting things out there that the idea that I might be able to do something interesting every now and again is very exciting. And it's the only thing that I do. Since I graduated high school, basically, all I've really done with my time is make photographs and look into photographs and study photography. I've got an honours degree in photography from the University of the Arts in London, so I'm really into photography, and I think photography in general inspires me. Do you feel that your photos need to match reality, or do you prefer interpreting the world like a painter? That is a really good question, and the answer to it is probably somewhat murky. I can't really do it particularly concisely. I mean, I guess I enjoy the idea of photographing reality, but a reality that looks more like reality than real life, if that makes sense. Like the way that I choose to present a scene or a person or the colors of a photograph are not necessarily meant to be out of this world. They're just meant to be slightly different from the way that one might traditionally see a scene presented, if that makes sense. I'm not sure that does make sense. I'll try and elaborate. So if I make a photograph of a forest scene, then I want it to look like a forest scene, and I want the colors to be somewhat accurate in relation to the forest scene, but I want it to be such a nice picture of a forest scene that it makes people think of every forest scene they've seen before. So it alludes to the idea of the picture at large as opposed to just being a picture. Any plans on making a photo book in the near future? Not really. If I ever make a photo book, it's going to be a photo book that's based on a project that I've been working on for a really long time. I mean, I do have a plan for a photo book. The images I made in the rural South Africa on medium format film videos, those images were like testers for a project that I'm going to go shoot there, hopefully not too long from now. And that will be a book, if it turns out right. I hope it will. But I'm not just going to make a book for the sake of making a book, if that makes sense. I mean, maybe at some point I could do like a retrospective, but Where I am right now, I feel like I've only just started to make photographs that would be representative of where I'd like my body of work to be as a whole. So I wouldn't really want to do a retrospective of work I've already made. Like work I've made within the last 6 months and then in the next 4 years. I'd do a retrospective of that in like 8 years, you know? Do you prefer Portra 400 or Portra 800? Portra 400. I shoot pretty much only Portra 400 for work that I need to look a certain way, or work where I want the colors to be able to be molded into what I need them to be, because Portra is a very malleable film stock and it scans very nicely. I am going to start shooting Ektar 100 for landscapes now though, because I do struggle sometimes with the cyan base cast that Portra has. Also, I'd prefer to push Portra 400 to 800 or 400 to 1600 or even 3200 than Portra 800, because Portra 400 pushes a lot nicer than Portra 800 in my experience. How do you get them colors? Why are your colors so good? How do you get such beautiful colors? How to get god tier colors? I'm going to try and not answer this in a particularly long way, because I could get really deep into this and then this video would be far too long, but the way that colors look in my work isn't because I've got some trick up my sleeve and I know something that no one else knows, and that's why things render that way. The two things that contribute to my colors are I scan on an Imacon, which is common knowledge, and you could rent scanning time on an Imacon if you wanted to and go and get some Imacon scans, but they wouldn't look like mine because I've spent like 5,000 hours staring at the computer screen, working only with Portra 400, or mainly with Portra 400, to develop an understanding of that film stock and the ways in which it can be interpreted in different scenes and scenarios. I don't do anything that you couldn't find out within 5 minutes of looking up how to color grade, because there isn't really anything that one can do outside of basic color grading to get a picture to look a certain way. It's more about the understanding that you have of color and the ways in which it can be molded and interpreted differently and presented but still make sense, because technically color grading and getting a unique color going is misrepresenting color in a certain way. I mean, you can get really good neutral colors and saturate them nicely, and that would give you a photographic look, but most of what people call color grading or the film look in film photography is color casts that one chooses to put on a picture. I try to avoid having color casts that are too heavy, but I fail at times, and that's how I get my look. My look is basically my failing in grading photography. What was the first film camera you started shooting with? I picked up, the first film camera I had experience with, I didn't really put film through it because I didn't know there was film in the world still in like 2012, was my dad's Ricoh KR5. The first film camera that I bought and shot with was a Pentax K1000 that I bought in some sketchy area of London in 2015 off of a guy who had probably stolen it in retrospect, and it had the name of some school somewhere in England like written on the back of it in red Tipex, and I shot with that for like 2 years, a year and a half before I bought another camera, which was the Nikon F3. Directly after the K1000 I bought a medium format camera as well, which was a Yashica 635, which I still have. I traded the K1000 to get my RB67 Pro SD body though. What was the reason you started photography? Because I sucked at fashion design, probably. No, I started photography seriously and I started pursuing it as a career path in 2015, I guess, when I went to Central St Martin's in London to do short courses in fashion design and photography to try and figure out what I wanted to do. And my lecturers were much more enthusiastic about my photography than my fashion design. But I had been making pictures for a long time before that. I started making photographs when I was like 11, not for the sake of making photographs, just because my dad came back from a trip and brought me this weird like stick camera, and I photographed this homeschooling project I'd been working on, which was beans. We were growing beans. And then after that, I got into photography because of Tumblr as well, because Tumblr was a big thing and I was really into Tumblr, and I wrote a lot of graffiti, so I'd photograph graffiti things, photograph my friends writing graffiti, photograph me writing graffiti. And I had a decently interesting portfolio to apply to Central St. Martin's with after that, and that's where it all started. Any hobbies outside of photography? Yes, I play a lot of video games. Not a lot, a decent amount. There's not really that much time these days with the amount of things I have going on to play video games particularly frequently, but I was really into competitive gaming when I was younger, and I still play very enthusiastically first-person shooters, like Warzone. I play Warzone because we've got local servers here as well. How frequently do you use a digital camera to make photos? Never, 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 never. Not in the last 5 years have I made a picture that I've used for anything digitally. I use my digital camera, which I'm filming this on, Nikon D610, to test lighting setups, basically, if I'm doing some particularly tricky lighting on a shoot, so that I can be sure that it's going to fall around about the way that I want it to. But I've kind of stopped doing that as well, because I have a decent enough understanding of lighting and strobes to just go with it, really. Would you move to another country for a photographic endeavor? Absolutely. I'd love to move somewhere else. The amount of time that I'd spend there probably varies depending on the location and how fruitful my exploits would be, but I'm really into the idea of, first off, visiting a bunch more of Africa, because Sub-Saharan Africa is a really interesting place that is quite underrepresented internationally in terms of being represented just as what it is. Africa in general is sort of mystified and idealized, and all sorts of misrepresentations overseas and to most people, but there's a lot of interesting stuff going on that I think would warrant being photographed properly with a somewhat democratic eye in Sub-Saharan Africa. And besides that, Brazil or South America, I'd really like to go there. Any advice on how to deal with imposter syndrome and feeling discouraged with art? Brian Burks, at the end of his most recent video, I think, mentioned that he has to contend with imposter syndrome frequently, and someone responded in the comments in the exact manner that I would. In fact, they pretty much said exactly what I was going to say when I went to the comment section, so I didn't even comment on it. But the idea of imposter syndrome and feeling discouraged with art, I feel like it stems from this idea that you need to put things out in the world to be enjoyed by other people to continue making work. And for me, I got to a point eventually, because I did deal with imposter syndrome, and it just got me super down for like the first 3 years I was making things. And then eventually I just realized I'm into photography because I like making photographs, and if I'm making photographs that I like, then that's all I'm concerned with. And that's where I'm at right now. If I get a niggling of feeling, oh, maybe I shouldn't be doing this because there's so many better people out there, or yada yada, I'm not doing it to try and out-compete the people that are better than me at photography, because I never will do that. There are always going to be people that make better work than me. But I'm trying to out-compete myself, and in out-competing myself, I have reasonable goals to strive towards, and nothing to really feel bad about. Is Will in a sheepskin, or is sheep in a Will skin? I think the sheep came first, so Will is in a sheepskin. Best way to meet photographer friends? I met pretty much all of my friends who are photographers through Instagram, or through meeting people through Instagram and then interacting with them in real life and meeting more people that way. So Instagram probably, or the internet. I mean, if there's someone whose work you really admire and you'd like to have a conversation with them, then reaching out and telling them you'd like to have a chat or buy them a coffee or something is probably the best way to go about it. I mean, that's what they taught me at university. They said, if there's a photographer who you want to talk to, who has really interesting work, or maybe even assist them down the line, then ask them out for a coffee, and you will both get a very good idea of whether you could interact positively in the future. And that leads into the next question, which is, how did you meet Kent? Kent as in my good friend Kent Andreasen, good friend and exceptional photographer. I met Kent through Instagram. He put a story out when he was in London like 5 years ago, asking, like 4 years ago, asking for a tripod. He needed a tripod for a shoot. So I went to the university equipment room and took out a tripod and lent that tripod from the university equipment room to him. Probably wasn't allowed to do that, but it was worth it in the end. And then we just started hanging out in London, grabbed a few beers a couple of times, and then grabbed some beers in Cape Town. And whenever we were in the same country, we'd meet up once or twice to grab a beer. And then eventually, like 3 years down the line, he asked me to be his assistant, which is one of the greatest honors I have in life, to be honest. He's an amazing photographer, and getting to help him make things is a sublime experience, which I'm going to tell you a bit more about in the not too distant future. Has your time printing in the darkroom affected the way you edit photos and vice versa? Absolutely. My entire understanding of film stocks, especially Portra, comes from printing it in the darkroom, because the darkroom gives you sort of a neutral almost idea of the way the negative actually is, if you manage to color balance it decently. And taking that into account when I'm grading pictures digitally is probably why I get colors to look the way I do. I didn't mention it earlier with the first color questions, but I also use a reference grade monitor. I have an ISO, can't remember what exact model it is, but it's an ISO with a color calibration sensor built in, and it self-calibrates itself fairly frequently, although I'm pretty sure it's not meant to do it that frequently. But anyway, I've got a reference grade monitor that I use, and what that means is that the colors that that thing puts out are going to be the colors that are represented in print, and are also going to be a good neutral for most other people's monitors, which will have some sort of color cast on them. Favorite contemporary photographer? Stephen Gill. I didn't have to think about that because I thought about it when I read that picture, but Stephen Gill makes incredibly interesting work, and he isn't super obsessed with the idea of photography being this one specific thing. Like, his body of work is not, I wouldn't say all over the show, that's not a good way to describe it, but he's interested in a lot of different things, and it's not necessarily about high quality photographs a lot of the time, or photographs that look a certain way. His series of birds on a pole, which I'm pretty sure was shot with just like a wildlife camera and then printed nicely and retouched decently. I think about that so often because it's such a incredibly interesting photo series and beautiful, but it's also not necessarily the world's most high effort project. Like, to me, a lot of the time, I'm obsessed with the idea of like, I'm gonna make a photo that will be super hard to make, and that's why it's gonna be good. And looking at a lot of Stephen Gill's work, it's like, well, this is incredibly good, and I wouldn't say that it wasn't hard to make or conceptualize, but the actual action of making the photograph of those birds on the pole, for example, he wasn't even involved in, and I find that super interesting. Favorite dead photographer? My favorite dead photographer is a bunch of different dead photographers who all got together at some point in the late 18th century to photograph the Niagara Falls in this book, which I'll show you when we get to that question, which is favorite photo books. My favorite photo book of all time is this nifty one that I have in front of me here, because it is absolutely beautiful. And it wasn't really made in a time when photo books were about books of photography that people would look at and think, wow, this is cool photography, and the author is so great, and all that sort of thing, because it's a bunch of different photographers that worked for the Albertype Company. This book was published in, 1893, by the way, so this book is pretty old. And it's just photographs of Niagara Falls from different angles by different photographers. Very traditional and static compositions, probably made with a field camera of some sort. But the fact that people were making this sort of thing 100 years ago, I just find so encouraging, because if they could make this back then, what could we get up to now, you know? and that's my favorite photo book of all time. But I have some other ones that I'll show you. This one is called Quantum Light by David Benjamin Sherry, and it has this nifty sort of, not holographic, but shifting color cover, which ties very well into the book itself, because the book is all about experimenting with color and the way in which color is represented in photography. So it's got some really heavy color casts and incredibly interesting compositions and monochrome pictures and graphic design even. And I'd really recommend picking it up if you can. I'm pretty sure I got this off Amazon in like 2016, so maybe it's still there. This is also a favorite. So Re by Lena C, Emery, and I'm not sure I can show some of these on YouTube because there's nudity, but we'll see. And it's just a really lovely, lovely, lovely book through and through. Like texturally, the cover is this sort of linen with a debossed picture on the front, and what is it? No, yeah, embossed. Anyway, and embossed writing on the background. And then the pictures themselves are just these photographs of women in a traditional Japanese house, I guess. Just interacting and being. Not really sexual in any way, but there is a bunch of nudity. And then it's got this rice paper trick, you know? It's not never done before, where in a photo book they'll have rice paper to just show you the picture blurred through the paper, and then when you turn the page you get the full idea. But it's a really nice effect that ties quite well into this body of work, because it adds to the feeling of softness that the majority of the photographs have, I feel. And finally, also not really a photo book in the traditional sense of photo books, but this is a book called The First World War from 1934. And it's basically just a collection of press photographs from that time. And it's really interesting to look back on, because it's a book that was published before World War II, but after the First World War. So I guess it's kind of ironic in that way. And I also just really enjoy the photography and the texture of the paper, because when it comes to old books, you're sort of experiencing way more of what the images are trying to represent than if you Google things like the First World War, because pictures on Google are pictures that have been curated by someone to speak to what it is they're trying to say about the First World War. So there's a lot of stuff that gets left out, I suppose. But in this book, you've got literally everything that someone in 1934 thought would be relevant to include in a book of collections of photographs of the First World War. And the texture of the print and everything is really cool. It's got this like rough paper, and the ink feels like it'll rub off still. And I really dig that. I am into photo books. This is probably a really long video at this point. Favorite film stock and format: Portra 400 in 120. Cape Town Fish Market Contact Street Photography Video release date. We're in September now. Let's say January. I can't remember what exact date in January the video will be released, but is it January 1st? Maybe. Whenever my January video comes out, I'll try and make it the Contacts street photography video on fish for you, Aaron. 35mm scans on the Imacon. I just want to see some. Here are a bunch. Not necessarily of anything particularly good. These were just photographs that I had negatives of that I hadn't scanned when I left London, so I scanned them on my Imacon, which was immensely painful because it takes forever to scan 35mm on that thing. Thoughts on YouTube photography in general? Do you have a favorite channel? That is a dangerous question, because I feel like whatever I answer to that question, someone is going to get mad at me. But I'll try and be as honest and candid about things as I can without insulting anyone, because I'm never keen on insulting anyone. And there isn't really much of a chance of that happening anyway, because there's a bunch of people doing things that they're very enthusiastic about. But YouTube film photography in general, I don't think film photography would be where it is now if it weren't for people putting videos out on YouTube, like the original cats like Matt Day and them, catering to an audience that didn't exist when they started making things. Like if, say for example, you wanted to start shooting film in 2015 and then got a roll and you didn't know what to do with it and it turned out garbage and you're like, wow, what a waste of time, then you probably would have stopped shooting film. But if in 2015 you picked up a roll of film and shot it and it came out bad, and then you went on YouTube and looked into like, how can I do things better, then Matt Day would have been there to tell you what it is that you were doing wrong. And for that, I reckon that side of the film photography sphere on YouTube is immensely useful for continuing people's interest in it and nourishing a burgeoning hobby for a very, very large portion of people. I mean, most of the people who are on YouTube watching film photography things are people who come here to learn or be inspired, I guess. And in that way, it's cool. But the other side of the coin is, I feel there's a lot of work that people make for their film photography YouTube channel that isn't necessarily particularly inspiring for them, because they're trying to appeal to the film photography trope, which has been nurtured largely by film photography on YouTube, which is the sort of Stephen Shaw, William Eggleston, Todd Hido look that has been merged into one thing that people call film photography, like the tropes, like vintage cars and gas stations. All of that is just based off of the fact that there were cats who put out successful YouTube videos, I suppose, that idealized the idea of work from photographers they liked, like Stephen Shaw or Todd Hido or William Eggleston. But, okay, now that I've pointed out the bad things, the reason I have a channel and started a channel is because there's guys like Brian Burks and Bray Hunziker out there. Literally, before I started this channel, I'd just maybe for 3 weeks or so been watching, no, 3 months, maybe for 3 months been watching Bray's videos, and the way he does things sort of brought it home to me that you can make photographs on YouTube without it being about making photographs on YouTube, you know? And the same thing goes for Brian Burks. And Brian and Bray are very different channels, but I feel like they're both very true to themselves and who they are as a person and what their photographic interests are. And that's what inspired me to start doing this, because I figured if I can make things on YouTube without it seeming lame or detracting from my photographic body of work as a whole, then I'll do it. And I feel like at this point I've done a decent job of that, and I hope to continue doing so like those cats have. What are your top 5 favorite films, movies? Pretty much all of the top 5 would be movies by Akira Kurosawa, I think. Yeah. Just any Akira Kurosawa movies. All of them are in my top 5. Top 1 of that top 5 of Akira Kurosawa movies, though, would be Ran. Just based on the visuals of it all. When are you going to do a hand printing tutorial? In the very near future. Where and from when do you get your daily inspiration? There's a website called American Suburb X with more inspiration and intimidation than any other photographic website that I reckon everyone would benefit from checking out. What is Ken Rockwell going to do now that Velvia 50 is discontinued? Shoot Velvia 100, like I do, and then hopefully get it developed properly. How the hell do you shoot analog content for YouTube? I am not sure what that question means. I'm not sure if it's a compliment, as in you make nice photographs, do they belong on YouTube sort of thing, or how do you do things so consistently? But I like doing what I do. I enjoy all of this very much. I enjoy making photographs, I enjoy making videos, and that's how and why I do it, because it's something I enjoy. If I ever stopped enjoying it, I'd probably stop doing it. And the last question, an incredibly long amount of time in. I'm probably going to have to edit this down quite heavily. What's your photographic career goal? My career goal, my ideal lot in life down the line would be to earn enough of a living selling prints and doing things that don't involve me having to be at home in front of a computer screen, to be able to travel around Africa making photographs and then selling prints of those photographs. That is where I would like to exist ideally, just traveling a bunch in a car that I've bought in the not too distant future. I'm either going to buy a Toyota Surf or a Isuzu Frontier. At this point, I don't know, things might fluctuate because those keep going up in price, but my first car was a Toyota Surf in East Africa, and I really want one here. And an Isuzu Frontier is pretty much a Toyota Surf, but just an Isuzu. And that's going to do it for the questions, I reckon. I hope I've provided you with some interesting insights into what it is that I get up to and why I do things. And I'm sorry if my color answers disappointed you, because I'm sure that some people are going to be frustrated that my answer is basically that I sat down for thousands of hours and learned to understand color, but that is what it is because I don't do anything different besides scanning on an Imacon to the vast majority of people. And besides that, if you made it this far, because this thing is going to be very long, then I have an immense amount of appreciation for you, and thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I'll see you next week for something very, 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 very special. Probably the coolest video I'm going to have made for this channel up till this point, and possibly ever, so I'll catch you then.